welcome to today's video where we'll be taking a look at UEFA's 2023, financial landscape across the European uh, football pyramid. And of course, it's always good, right? Like to, peek behind the curtain and get a different perspective. Of course, right? FIFA also has some of these types of publications around, say, like the transfer market and professional players, which I can do. Or I'm planning on doing in a future video. And of course, right, with this entire a quick look at it, the common trend is looking at publicly traded companies or publicly available information that's more business and finance oriented, and using that as a way to glean some insights into like video games people play, football, and these types of consumer experiences. And so we'll see how much time this goes for. May or may not be the most exhaustive, but here's an overview of the contents. Of course, why reinvent the wheel when the fine people at UEFA have made this, revenues, operating costs, transfers, balance sheets, commercial stadiums, and, right? All of the you think about the levers, right, of what a sports business is, right? Because at the end of the day, whether you're a fan-owned club by socios to a multi-club group like like soon to be Fenway Sports Group, right? Right, you have top line revenue, you have your costs, you have levers you can pull, right, like through commercial and stadiums, uh, and all this, right, just goes to show that, right, the accelerating commercialization and professionalization of the business of football, uh, which of course may or may not be a good thing given how it metastasizes, but uh, such it is. And yeah, here's a nice thing, right? Just a reminder, right? If UEFA, right? Israel is included, Kazakhstan is included, and so it does give a pretty good overview, especially right when you peek out the top five. Record top line revenues across the ecosystem, 24 billion. This nice blurb, right? The Premier League is 5 to 12 times. Um, you know, sixth place, uh, and there'll be a map later on which shows like the revenue of each league, and it does pretty clearly show that there is a top five that is pretty distinguishable. But again, right to the point of like the Premier League is a super league, and of course I think the Super League idea by 822 is a horrible idea, just given how it really is a closed league with just that one gimmicky promotion slot. But the Premier League is a super league, and that shouldn't be ignored. And your growth rate again, right? The source of revenue, right? Of course, UEFA provides distributions to teams and leagues through like participation in European club competitions. Of course, broadcasting, commercial rate, which is very much up to clubs to try to brand themselves or take advantage of historical legacy, whereas broadcasting is a bit more dependent on the league or the country you play in. Gate receipts, of course, right? I imagine hospitality is also included. Or like concerts and right, and when we talk of stadiums, right, that's a big reason why like the new Bernabeu, right, has a new which our goal, right, is to make it multimodal, right, to have football games and then um, as well as then like to host a Taylor Swift concert, which may or may not force a rescheduling of Madrid's final game of the season. And of course, right, transfers, right, players are assets, and that's underestimated part of business models. And so here's the graphic that just illustrates how the Premier League really is a super league, right? And so England, right, 6.5 billion, um, which is right, Spain and Germany combined, right, which is uh, just in and of itself, right, again, like a very clear, when you think of like bottom table Premier League teams signing international top quality players, right, from France or Germany, right? Is there a reason why West Ham United can sign Lucas Paqueta from Lyon when Lyon arguably right much better pedigree and iconic stature in the game, right? It's because of this disparity between French football and English football in the finances term, right? Um, and again, right, and you think about continental European competitions, right? Right, so you have Dutch teams participate in European competitions. You have Turkish teams, Portuguese teams, um, as the areas where tough competitors to like the Big Five come from. It's like of course they have a hard time. As it makes of course they do compete, right? Like Benfica smashing Barca, and whatnot, right? A couple years ago. But when you think about the outcomes that you do see of why, like the argument that or the complaint that Champions League is always between the same like eight contenders, pretty much season to season. And well, and those eight contenders are those at the top of the pyramids, who are at in the countries and leagues that are at the top of this very top heavy European football pyramid. You know, and like of course with Russia being kicked out of UEFA competitions for who knows how long, right? Like this disparity is only going to increase, and of course the fact that Russia is sixth largest by a good margin, right, compared to the next runners up in the Dutch, um, is interesting, right, especially right like 180 million population, so it's certainly a big country, football heritage. You do have a lot of investment in football, right? With just looking at right, Zenit St. Petersburg, you have your four Moscow clubs, right? Dynamo, Spartak, CSKA, maybe Torpedo, right? As a side note, like the Eastern European and like the typology behind like just as right, like think of like AC for AC Milan, right? Association club, right? I think about like in the Eastern European context, right? Of like CSKA, right? You have CSKA Sofia in like in say Bulgaria, and you have CSKA Moscow, right? And that's well, or you have Dynamo Kiev, you have Dynamo Dresden, right? And so the interesting typology is that right, if it's CSKA, that indicates that the club has like originally or strongly influenced as part of like the military club, or if it's Dynamo, it's like that's for the police club. Uh, Spartak is a bit more like grassroots, a bit more like like a workers club. And then like Torpedo is like for the railroad workers, which is interesting, right? Think of what the Moscow derbies are, right? And it's you think about Spartak versus Dynamo. It's like it's probably not too relevant these days now that given like the financial backers of Spartak and whatnot is like I think Gazprom or like one of the big Russian conglomerates. It's kind of like not too much of the undertones these days, but it's a fun historical aside. But again, right, this just shows again like the financial pyramid, like how uh, wide the pyramid is, or how wide the gaps are. And when you think of right multi-club models, or like American investors just investing in football clubs all over the place, right? Well, like what are they investing into? And it's not the same as like the U.S. league system, but when you think of right, a multi-club model, um, you have like an English club investing into a French team to add to its portfolio. Or we think about a Manchester City football or a City football group, right? Like the clubs they have teams in. Or think about why Red Bull Salzburg in Austria is able to have that much relative dominance. And, well, it's just interesting to think of like what pond teams are fishing in. But I think this is a really nice graphic. Of course, screenshot it. Um, highlight your own country or league, or you just contextualize these things, right? When you think about transfer spending and right, because at the end of the day, right, it's not one to one, but generally, right, the bigger the club, it's like moving upstream, downstream, right? And so think about the movement of players, right? it flows to Germany, Italy, Spain, France, England, right? Portugal feeds into these guys. Um, if this was a more international thing, I'm sure like Brazil, Argentina, certainly flown to Portugal, and then out to these guys, right? Or flows into say like the Netherlands with Ajax and Feyenoord, uh, uh, and those clubs have strong reputations for player development, right? And then again, UEFA identifies as competitive imbalance, which of course is a bit ironic with the new Champions League format of how they are solidifying as competitive imbalance basically by changing the coefficient points to make it very Champions League heavy, um, giving within the four new Champions League slots, giving two of those to basically two of the big five, right? So it's probably going to always be England getting an extra Champions League slot to five teams, and then it's pretty much Spain, France, Germany, Italy fighting for like uh, that second of the two. Revenue. Okay, so here's focusing. Oh, and this is just top division club, right? So presumably, right, it's just top division, right? Then well, England's only gonna get more of a gap, uh, given how deep the English football pyramid is. Here's a nice visualization of how top heavy. Of course, um, so the average versus, of course, where it averages tend to be a bit more to the right, just given right. So pretty much for averages versus mediums, right? In anything where you can't be negative, right? The average then is always going to be, or very likely to be to the right, to be greater than the median, right? Just given, right, you're dragged to the right by the long tail outliers. So this is pretty much an indication, loosely speaking, uh, of competitive balance, right? And so, loosely speaking, right, the average English club is not again, right. I mean, 110 million, right, which is bigger than the gap between French and or between the Spanish. So of course, right, absolute and the absolute values do matter, but as a visualization, it does indicate something, or certainly how you want to fit your whatever argument you have, right? Which you think of like Spanish football, right? Pretty big disparity. Uh, French football, big disparity, right? Um, Portugal, big, right? And again, right? You think of right, well, how come the same teams end up competing, or why some leagues are a bit more variable than other leagues in terms of who the title contenders are for European and for the league title itself. Right? This is probably a good indicator, right? Like how much of this 100 is tilted by Paris Saint Germain, pushing French football out to the right, and then of course right, and PSG competing against say Clermont, uh, who have a it's a clear disparity. And again, right, something else to be noted, right? Some of these leagues are 20 team leagues, right? Like Premier League. Others, like France, are 18. Some of them are like 16. Um, so it's not like apples, apples to apples. But again, right, here's to the point of like why West Ham is able to sign a class player like Lucas Paqueta, right? Like Lyon is not in this list, right? Like you have Tottenham, big revenue growth. Back to the prior point about stadiums, right? And then you Spurs Stadium, right? Hosting NFL games, all these different types of events, right? But it really is baffling, right? You think of some of these clubs, right? Like Atleti, in like look at this, like Atleti, Inter, Milan, Dortmund, Juve, right? Behind a club like Spurs. Yeah, it's kind of baffling, right? And you think of like iconic clubs that aren't on this list, right? Like Olympique Marseille or uh, or any of like your iconic like European of like Red Star, Belgrade, um, like, right, like seriously, if like Brighton, West Ham, to be on this list, right, it's in the top 20. Like do what most people argue that Brighton and West Ham are in the top 20 most iconic European football clubs? Probably not, right? Like where's Roma? Where's one of the Portuguese top three, right? But again, right, and this shows um, again, right, like the strength of the Premier League. Again, right, it is also interesting to just highlight, like the big guys are the big guys, right? Like twice the size of your middle of the pack, right? And so I mean, if you think about a Super League, right, like this is right, minus like Napoli, minus like Brighton, West Ham, right? This lineup is kind of what the original Super League idea uh, included, right? Like a lot of these culprits um, signed on to the original Super League back in 2021. Um, and you can argue that it is kind of like pulling the drawbridge behind them. Uh, but yeah, interesting visualization and a lot to unpack here. Uh, in the interest of getting through everything, won't. Gate receipts again, another uh, indication, right? Here we can see English teams love, certainly the Premier League loves charging a lot for tickets, right? Compared to say like other leagues, right? Like the Bundesliga, where it's a bit more fan friendly for ticket prices. Yeah, and this is a nice graphic, right? If I compare the list of clubs here, the list of clubs here, interesting to see where some of these names, right, this is like West Ham, Brighton, right, disappear, right, and instead here I see Ajax, Celtic, Rangers, Roma, Marseille enter the mix, right? Which, and again, right, that's ultimately an indictment to some degree of like the league or of those clubs, right? But again, it just indicates how the Premier League um, is structured differently. Top 50 clubs, uh, Valencia, Rennes, Lille, Werder Bremen, Sporting Club Portugal, Leicester, Sevilla, Everton, Lazio, Eindhoven, Wolves, Southampton, Zenit, Real Betis, Freiburg. But again, I mean, come on, like for like I guess like think of pedigree, like Southampton, being above Sevilla or even like Everton, right? Like that's uh, old man shakes fist at at Cloud. RC Lon, Galatasaray, Stuttgart, maybe Benfica, maybe Athletic Club, uh, Feyenoord, Leeds, Villa, Napoli, uh, Rangers, Celtic, Frankfurt, Roma, Lyon. Yep. This is interesting. Like average get yield per fan. And here you can see right who's getting. So effectively, we can see who's getting price gouged, and you know, congrats to Spurs and of course PSG. The park they promised is a smaller stadium. So TV revenues, and again, right, this is kind of like how much bigger the Premier League broadcasting revenues are, or certainly how the Premier League has been more equitable distribution of broadcast revenues compared to say like Spain, where it's not quite as even. Um, and again, right, just how much more money the Premier League gets in revenue, broadcast deal cycles. Um, of course, as a consumer, right, I prefer for rights to be consolidated and be very long dated. So, this consumer experience is nice. Um, what is interesting is right to see like which leagues have longer duration or which ones are coming up for renewal, right? Like here we can see that the French league with COVID and how Canal pulled or whatever one of the large like I believe like Vivendi broadcasters pulled out of a deal. It's kind of like screwed the French league, the Ligue 1, especially with COVID. and how they're trying to pull back. I mean, just in the U.S., right? Like in the U.S., Premier League pretty accessible. La Liga, right? Premier League, Peacock, La Liga, ESPN, Serie, and Bundesliga, ESPN. Paramount gets you Serie A and UEFA competitions like Super Turkey and Liga are like on beIN Sport, which is impossible to get unless you're going to pay for Fubo, which is an extremely high price, which is horrible. So pretty much inaccessible if I want to watch Liga or Turkey, um, unless alternative means, right? Portugal is in like a mainly I believe like Hispanic focused or Latin focused streaming service, right? I just think about right distribution of just from a U.S. perspective, right? What rights are accessible, right? It's um, right like like ESPN is not bidding for all of these guys is the point. Commercial revenue, of course, right? Clubs with more pedigree are gonna make more. Right? Of course, Manchester United are gonna have much more commercial revenue than Luton Town, just given fan base and professionalization. Commercial revenue. Interesting that Union Berlin sneaks in, or Fenerbahce sneaks in. Leipzig being this high is a bit interesting. Probably some sponsorship, but again, right? It's interesting, right, to see like how these 20 clubs, the top 20, shifts, uh, and what clubs move up and down. Especially like in this top five, right? Like we've seen like City, Barca, over here PSG slide down a bit. So it's interesting to do a bit more of a postmortem. Just think about what's sliding up and down. Revenue from UEFA club competitions. Of course, Russia kicked out. It's a bit of a shame because that season in the 22-23 season, or 21-22, Spartak were doing pretty good coming up on top of their group with Napoli, uh, and they were going to play Leipzig, which could have been give them a chance, but it's a shame. Right, and again, right, top eight, right, Premier League 7, probably going to 8. Italy probably going to get 8 for the next season, right? 6, 5, 6, right? So again, right, another lever that just illustrates this the gap. UEFA revenue again, right? Here's where you see like Porto sneaking in, Benfica, Sevilla, right? Because ultimately, right, the UEFA revenue comes from sporting performance, right? For not only qualifying domestically for UEFA competition, but to then win games and progress through the knockout stage, right? Because each game provides a specific there's specific payments related to not performance, like winning a game, but also then what stage you get to, right? And so Sevilla being this high is arguably involved with Sevilla winning uh, Europa the Europa League. We're not commercial. Interesting detail, right? Subsidies on these clubs, related party donations for Russian clubs for 25, and that's probably an interesting aside for why Russia is at 1.1 billion. Uh, Interesting graphic where you just see again, right? And the big picture, right, is just how much for leagues that do have international TV demand, right? How much those broadcasting rights? Oh, I guess this is domestic, so it's not international, maybe. Um, but again, right, you do see how much like how interesting it is, like that ultimately, right, like gate receipts, which is kind of right. It's like a fixed lever you can pull, right, because your stadium only has so much capacity, and it's kind of antithetical to jack up the prices. Um, so it is interesting to see like how there's limited levers, right? Especially the smaller you go down the football pyramid, right? Something like San Marino, right? Operating costs, right? Wage inflation. Here you can get a loose sense of financial sustainability. Wages, probably, of course, right? Football, there's no U.S. style collective bargaining, um, so it's a bit more malleable. Wages, right? Again, it's always funny, right? Seeing like Leicester, you know, in the champion, or I guess they were in the Premier League, right? Leicester outspending, right? Like Roma. Again, right? In terms of like what you would think a club would warrant. But again, right? Just the commercialization in different leagues. Again, interesting, right? To see who your big spenders are, right? Barca being this high, right? And that financial purgatory. Player wages down at top of market. OPEX, inflation. Top clubs. Uh, too much transfers. Profitability. Yeah, French football again. French football is right, especially in 2022. Right, coming out of COVID. Right, the league shrinking from 20 teams to 18 teams, and then the broadcast rights being in disarray with the whole bad timing and then botched transfer of a new bidder. Clubs with the highest operating profits. This is interesting, right? Because like PSG isn't to be found here. Barca isn't to be found here. Uh, right again, right? Like I'm picking out Brighton, so it's a bit unfair, but right. And then clubs with the most losses, maybe not most, but just standouts, right? I mean, here's Barca, right? Roma, Monaco, Trabzonspor, Villarreal, I believe Royal Antwerp, Genk or Ghent, Belgium, Lille, Sparta, Praha. Um, right. But again, right, you think of like how big these clubs are, right? Like Milan got sold for like I believe like 2 billion, right? At the end of the day, right, only generating 74 million in operating profits, right? Which just kind of shows, right, like there's certainly like the multiples that you're paying, or you just think about right some of the publicly traded clubs, right, like Dortmund and Lyon, right, can give you a view. Transfer costs. Again, right here we can see who's spending the most, right? And here, right, 83. The average or the median English club spends 83 on transfers, uh, net, whereas right, France or Italy 40, Germany 40, right? Like incredible spending, right? And disparity. Transfer income, right? And when it comes to selling the players, right, a bit more of a different picture, right? Here we see, right, Portugal kind of punching above their weight. Lower transfer spend in general, net transfer, right, and the transfer results. And so here we can kind of see, right, which clubs, you know, just spend a lot buying players, right? And it's kind of like the culprits that you kind of expect, minus Newcastle and Villa, and the clubs that do the most selling, right? Brighton, Leo, Ajax, Shakhtar, Donetsk, Rennes, Sporting Club, Eindhoven, Leipzig. Where's that? Salzburg, Braga, Monaco, right? It's kind of like again, right? So like the conception that you have when you think of like Fabrizio tweets, it's like you can kind of transfer this mental model. Pre-tax, largest all-time profits. Now again, right? To that point, right? Like pre-tax versus post-tax, cash expense versus non-cash expense, right? That's a bit more of accounting fun stuff. But again, right, interesting to see what names here. Like again, like Freiburg sliding in, um, and then right, Galatasaray, Porto being on the downside. Financing costs, right? Of course, right. Your interest rates increased. generally, certainly in Europe with the ECB, European Central Bank, and so naturally, right, as you refinance or acquire new financing, paying higher rate. Squad costs. Um, interesting point. It's a bit nuanced. Equity. Of course, right. Accounting formula A equals L plus your assets equals liabilities plus shareholders' equity. So if you got negative equity, right, liabilities are bigger than your assets, which conceptually isn't the best, or it's certainly not the indication of the optimal capital structure. Coloration is a bit difficult, but congrats to France and Italy for not being or take that back. Bad France and Italy for only having net equity 0 to 25. Kudos to right, Sweden, England, unsurprisingly. Net equity, Fiorentina, right? So it's kind of like clubs that are right because equity, right? It's on a balance sheet, so equity does carry over from year to year through retained earnings. So it's kind of right. These clubs are doing pretty well financially, whereas these clubs struggling a bit financially, right? Lazio, Maccabi, Haifa, and Israel, Besiktas, right? I think you're not right. Like some of these Turkish clubs. Asset base, of course, amortization of transfer fees, right? Like you don't book the full 100 costs, right? You can spread it out. Average transfer cost of 20 squads. Um, so pretty much, right? This right money the clubs are spending, right? And so who are your big spenders? United, uh, Chelsea, and not so much to say here because like, these are the big spenders you'd expect, but it is always funny, right? Like United being perennially on top of these lists of transfer spend, right? And think about your performance, you know, coming in last in the Champions League group, right? To Copenhagen, Galatasaray, and Bayern Munich, right? Interesting, but again, right, just right, like 4x what Milan can spend, right? United have spent, right? Again, just financial disparities. That's gone up. Commercial side, sponsors. It is interesting. To the sponsors, right? You think of like Aston Villa playing Ajax in the knockout stages of the Conference League, right? And how where Aston Villa had to have a new. Your normal sponsor is right BK8, but against which is a gambling company or betting company. But when they played in the Netherlands, because of apparently Dutch sponsor regulations, right? You can't have a betting sponsor, and so they had to change it to a just a non-profit, which is interesting, right? When you think about like how these things interplay, and that's probably like the European landscape in general, right? We have a lot of different markets, so naturally different rules for each of those national markets, but more through EU integration or just trade, right? Interact a lot. Financial services for stadium rates, certainly in the U.S., right? You can see the U.S. Bank Stadium, Citi Field, etc. Right? Leagues, restrictions on tobacco, alcohol, or political messaging. Um, Here we can see right betting and gambling, big shirt sponsors, energy, Russia. Gazprom comes to mind. Excuse me, that's in the past, right? And here we see like the big rise of betting as shirt sponsors uh, is interesting. Here we can see how many different monetization options there are and how it differs from place to place, right? Uh, yeah, convention, right? Kit sponsor, main sponsor, back sponsor, back sleeve, and back shorts, right? Interesting. So I honestly, this is a pretty interesting page. Uh, just look at top 5 kit manufacturers: Adidas, Nike, Macron, Puma, Joma, which is Spanish. Um, interesting, right? Of course, you have your like. Is it interesting that Macron is on top of Puma, right? Because again, right, so you think of like the big clubs that you think of, right? Like Milan, um, or Dortmund, right? Are Puma, but then Macron sneaks in. Which is interesting. Another interesting, right? Like I don't see Kappa on this list. Um, top five manufacturers, but again, right? It's like the top 20 clubs, right? Adidas, Nike, Puma, and like, interesting nuances in these different markets. Record kit revenue, uh, in Frankfurt, Celtic Leeds, right? So when you think about like streetwear, or like, of course, right, you can always buy like replica jerseys and stuff. Which, if I'm being honest, right, like spending $13, $14 on a replica jersey, from various reputable sellers, compared to spending like $80 on a jersey when they're coming from basically the same factory. Um, and so always an interesting discussion. But again, right, just interesting to see like anything about just like streetwear, right? Of like what jerseys you'll probably see walking the street. This is kind of like indication, or certainly what clubs want to sponsor. But again, right here we see like traditional, the legacy clubs, right? Ajax, Celtic, Leeds, sneaking in, right? Because they have very right merchandising revenues or kit revenues, right? People have to buy these kits, which indicates a fandom. Titles, just like the leagues themselves. Yeah, like the right, like the old like Barclays Premier League intro, or France, right? Uber Eats League on, and now McDonald's League on, which is a bit humorous. Stadiums, right? Stadiums, right? It's a big lever, to be pulled to maximize the revenues a club can control, right? Like a club, you can't control sporting performance directly. You can't control any UEFA reforms directly, right? So think about like what assets the club has, right? It's like players, and then also the stadium is a big one. Of course, assuming you own your stadium, right? And of course, right, the entire thing about a lot of clubs, right, especially in the Big Five that aren't England, is the fact that right, the city owns the stadium, right? Like San Siro in Milan, right, shared by Milan and Inter, is owned by the city. The Parc des Princes is owned uh, by the city of Paris, right? And here we see, right, like Spain, Italy, and France, right, catching up to the commercialization of stadiums in the Premier League. Interesting visual, of course, right? I do think a lot of this discussion, right, or certainly when you think of like the top 20 clubs, right, like that's naturally going to be again like top five focus, just given right the financial disparities that exist, right? But this is a nice reminder, right, of just um, all of like the advances and projects being done throughout the European football pyramid, right? Atlanta, PAOK in Greece, right? And again, right, and like just like the different numbers, right? Like a 53,000 stadium versus 19,000 for Plovdiv. Capacity disparities. It's pretty much every league has disparities. Is the idea, and that makes sense, right? As you move down, like your clubs towards the bottom of the top tier, right? You're gonna naturally have clubs that are smaller, uh, uh, that are competing. Club ownership even split between private and public. Uh, quite interesting. So these 11 leagues being solely associations or foundations is interesting. Um, public institutions, Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, complex ownership structures. And it is interesting, right? So owned by private, by domestic or foreign private entities, right? Listed on stock exchange. So you have a couple public com again, right? Like the liquidity is not great. Or order on some like local exchange where like the fees if you're in, to access it are quite high. But again, right? And here you see, right? Like 280 plus 92, right? 372, uh, which is literally equal, right, to the other methods, right? And that's probably only going to tilt even more into probably like the foreign private entity party, right? As American investors keep on entering the space. Slowdown in top club takeovers. Interesting timeline. Um, right, Lee's new ownership group. Solid, right, in this probably interesting stories of who are the buyers, right? Dutch, Malaysia, Americans, right? Yeah, again, right, like just like the role American investors are increasingly starting to play. Private capital, right? You just think of right investments, private investment firms or alternative asset managers are making in like the league structure, right? Think of like CVC and their deals with La Liga, or the attempted deals with the DFB in Germany, right? And presumably, right, if the top of the revenue pyramid is interesting enough, and probably at some point, something's downstream, like just clubs themselves, can be interesting. Multi-club investment. I mean, personally, uh, I'm not as anti against it. I think it just depends on if the multi-club owner wants to be competitive across all of the teams, or if the multi-club owner is going to very literally say, "You are a feeder club," right? I think in the case of like Chelsea uh, and Strasbourg, right? I think they're pretty. I don't think their Blue Co is going to be investing in Strasbourg. I think they're very clearly just going to use it as a way to develop players, get the work permit points. I think in that case, right, that's a bad multi-club investment, right? Because you're pretty much relegating Strasbourg to always be a bottom of league on team. But if you look at other multi-club models, like as much as I don't want to say it, but think of like the Red Bull model, right? Like Salzburg competitive and Leipzig competitive, right? I think they invest into both. Let's make them both competitive, right? I think that's the difference, right? Multi-club model where it really is like a pyramid, or is it something like a city football group where like um, teams throughout are competitive, and so fans of those clubs, of course, like they're losing out on some of like the ownership, but they can at least have the hope of being competitive. Whereas I think in the case of Strasbourg, I think until there's a new ownership group, right, it's probably a bit relegated. Rules on multi-club ownership. Of course, the bird has kind of sailed, um, and right, can't really do retroactive. Countries with the most clubs involved. Yeah, so you can kind of see, right, like where do clubs want to move investment in players to and from, right? U.S. sneaks in, Portugal sneaks in, Brazil is probably going to grow in future years. Of course, these four things probably because like the PIF taking over uh, four Saudi clubs. Um, yeah, so multi-club owners, right? Good old Yanks. Um, yeah, and so I mean it'll be interesting to see how it shapes out in the coming years, or if more players sneak in. Yeah, but I think a lot of the critiques about multi-club owners, right? It all like some of the critiques of like internal dealing, like right, something like this, right, does a pretty good job of disproving that. But yeah, I think the bigger point is just, is the multi-club model, is it solely for the benefit of the club at the top, or are the investments and focus on competitiveness going to be spread, reasonably evenly throughout the pyramid? And then these are some very interesting and nice footnotes that will probably be its own separate video, just giving the level of detail that should be given to each of these uh, UEFA confederations. But this was the UEFA 2023 report. Of course, some of the data is 2022, but I think, right, as a football fan, probably watch um, more live football during a regular week than I should, um, which is probably an indictment of myself and my priorities. But I think, again, I'll link to this in the description. Uh, but again, right, common thing, right, where you can find more official information and data to help inform your views, then you should take advantage of it, especially when they're public facing, right, for transparency reasons. I think a report like this is really interesting. There's so much detail, right, in these blurbs that I didn't get to, and just giving a high level overview. Uh, so I encourage you to look at this yourself, right? See what clubs uh, you see, right? Maybe this gives you more fuel to call, you know, uh, Arsenal a banter club, right? Or whatever. Of course, it's not really call Barca a banter club. Uh, but yeah, so I'll link to this. But yeah, thank you for watching, and